that the armed forces are governing the state. Asουάνι is a man brought up in a rather aesthetic upper-class family back in the Cairo. He studied in Cairo, Chicago, and Madrid, where he studied Spanish literature, and of course he also studied dentistry in the United States. Let's not forget that one of the most important works of Mr. Asουάνι is the Jacobian building that refers to the so-called European center of Cairo, which was unfortunately lost, this cosmopolitan metropolitan, due to, of course, to the immigration and the uprising of the Islamic movement in Egypt. He was one of the most powerful persons and one of the more important figures of the 2011 revolution. He was on a daily basis at the Tahrir Square. Now, his work, under the title The Republic of False Truths, that we will be discussing this afternoon, is at least one of the most comprehensive literature narration of the revolution of 2011. And of course, it refers to the dilemma and, let's also forget, to the so-called disappointment of this revolution. It is a multifaceted representation of course, the Egyptian society that explains how Islamists, along with the army, in a rather ambiguous and rather strange to us alliance, they managed to suppress the revolution of young people and, of course, the dreams. Asουάνι, despite the constant Sisi oppositions to his work, and I could say that the Sisi is even more aggressive against Mubarak. He tried to remain in Egypt for many years. Unfortunately, he was expelled, I dare to say, from the country, and he was self-exiled, and his books today are unfortunately forbidden in his native country, Egypt.
An avid fan of your books. My first question would be, you're a dentist by studies and profession. Was your turn to writing, your own way of protesting against injustice in Egypt and things you wanted to change, at a time when few people actually protested?
I'm sorry, I don't hear the question.
My question is, you trained and worked as a dentist before you turned into a full-time writer. Was writing for you a way of protesting against injustice, a way of conveying a message for change, especially at a time when you started, when very few people protested in Egypt?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would like to tell you that there is an echo. I think that writing has been always a defense for the human values. Let's say artistic defense of the human values. The core of any literary work is the human values. Accordingly, of course, the injustice, the cruelty of the dictatorship motivates writers to write. Being a dentist was a choice, was an advice by my late father, who was a writer too, and a lawyer. Why? Because you cannot make your living from fiction writing in Egypt. Even Naguib Mahfouz, who had the Nobel Prize, he had to work for the government till the age of retirement. Accordingly, you have to have another profession. That's why I'm still a dentist, by the way. I'm still practicing in Cairo. But of course, I'm exceptional, a kind of exceptional case, because I have been a best-selling novelist in the West. I'm translated to 37 languages. Accordingly, this brings money, but this is not the rule. The rule is that any fiction writer should have another profession, and that's how I became a dentist.
Well, the Jacobian building was the book that made you known in Greece and was much appreciated. And you wrote it, we can say it's a kaleidoscope of Cairene society before the revolution of 2011. Yourself, you were raised in downtown Cairo, in the old European-like center of the city, when it was still a cosmopolitan metropolis with its urban grandeur and life. And I mean, as a reader, I sensed in the Jacobian building that sweet nostalgia you have for a Cairo that is no more, and it's the same nostalgia that the Greek people who lived in Egypt and had to be repatriated feel for the cities Alexandria and Cairo where they lived. I would ask you how has Cairo and how has Cairene middle-class life changed from since you were young? And do you think this is a result of internal migration or the Wahhabi influence, or both, perhaps?
Absolutely. I didn't live the years of the 50s or the 40s, but I was a kid in the 60s. Accordingly, that was the end of the cosmopolitan era in Egypt. I still remember. I was a pupil in the Lycée Français du Caire, and I had Greek professors and Greek students. But everybody, I'm talking about the late 60s, mid and late 60s, and everybody was talking about leaving the country. And when I grew up and I studied this era, because as I told you, I was not there in the 50s, I found that Egypt had been a cosmopolitan place for centuries, and the Greek experience was remarkable, was great. Why? Because the Greek people, many of them escaped because of the massacres committed by the Ottoman Empire. So when you study the Greek immigrations, you will find waves of immigrations. And these Greek people lived in Egypt as Egyptians, and they were treated as Egyptians who happened to have Greek origins. And interestingly, when France, Israel, and Britain attacked Egypt in 1956, many people don't know that the Greek people in Port Said made a group of fighters to defend their second or first country, Egypt. And many people don't know that there was one martyr, a Greek martyr. I wrote about him in Port Said. And I must tell you, unfortunately, that after 1956, the Greek community had a promise from Nasser, then they will be treated differently, because that was the beginning of this culture of xenophobia. I don't know, you know what's a xenophobia, right?
Yes.
So the Greek people were considered, at least Nasser said that they are going to be treated differently because it's a very special community, and they fought for us, they fought to defend Egypt, etc., etc. What happened is that Nasser, unfortunately, did not keep his promise. Accordingly, you had waves of immigrations outside Cairo. I live in New York now, and I meet many Greek friends, and many of them were either born or raised in Alexandria. And of course, Alexandria in the first place is a Greek city, as everybody knows. So accordingly, I'm writing now, as we discussed before, I'm writing now my new novel about Alexandria, and I have Alexandria in the 60s, in the turning point. And I have 3 or 4 main characters who are Greek people who lived and were born in Alexandria.
I'm sure this is going to have a huge impact here because there's so much nostalgia by the people who were born and raised there. The experience of being Greek in Egypt has marked them forever. And because generally now I think we are reevaluating, I mean, my generation, the 20th century, and there's a lot of things we don't know, especially about the diaspora. But what has really impressed me in your books is your ability to feel empathy and to portray successfully people from very different backgrounds, people from the working class, people from the aristocracy, ambitious businessmen, entrepreneurs, military officers, TV presenters, etc. People very different in their ideas as well as their social standing. Do you think that your experience being brought up in Cairo, even as cosmopolitanism was dying, but it was still there, do you think all this sort of intellectual atmosphere and multicultural atmosphere helped you in being able to understand and feel empathy for people of totally different backgrounds and ideas?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. The atmosphere in which I was raised was totally cosmopolitan. My father, as I told you, was a writer, and I was an only child, so I was very much related to my father, and my father was a real liberal. First, second, I lived when I was kid because I used to spend 3 months in Alexandria during the holidays, the vacations, and I lived the end of this era. And when I proposed the idea of my new novel to the publishers through my agent, I wrote that Alexandria for me was the other woman, the other woman. If the other woman was all the seduction of the other woman. And I told in the proposal a true story. There was a grocery downtown Alexandria called Argyris, a Greek man, and this grocery was very special but very significant about the culture of Alexandria, and I would say the culture of Egypt. The grocery was divided into one door for the grocery and the other door for the bar.
Oh, yeah.
So if you go, when I was kid, if you go to buy cheese or to buy something, then you will use the door for the grocery. And the people who want to drink went through the other door, and of course they were served by the grocery something to eat with the drink. And I wrote that I used to go from this door, the grocery door, to buy cheese for my family when I was kid, and it took me 30 years to know how to use the other door. So everybody was accepted, everybody was tolerated in Alexandria. My stepfather and mother, my wife is from Alexandria. They speak Greek. Why? Because when they got married in the 50s, early 50s, they were the only Egyptian couple in the building. So they had to deal with their Greek neighbors all the time. So they can communicate in Greek.
When the 2011 revolution in Egypt was taking place, you know, Egypt is very close to Greece, and we've had this history of comings and goings and relations that goes to antiquity, really. So Greek eyes were set on Egypt, and there was a lot of sympathy for what was going on. And I remember especially young people feeling very ecstatic and with solidarity about events in Cairo, in Tahrir, and elsewhere in the country. Could we say now that the revolution was hijacked, that it was cancelled by the army and the brotherhood together? Would that be a fair assessment, you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that was the deal from the very beginning. And now with the emails which are released by the emails of the CIA to Hillary Clinton after the revolution, it has become a historical fact that the army decided to make an alliance with the Muslim Brothers to stop the revolution. And of course, this alliance was backed or supported by the American administration. But basically, the army, yes, and this is not the first time. Since 1952, Nasser made an alliance with the Muslim Brothers against the democratic forces, Al-Wafd party. It's called the delegation, the biggest liberal political party in our history. And then he used the Muslim Brothers just to crack down on the democratic force. And then at some point he turned against the Muslim Brothers and put them in prison. The same happened in 2011. So, and interestingly, the military fascism and the religious fascism, they are cousins. They have many things in common. They almost share every opinion on democracy, on the woman, on the religion, on the people who are not Muslims. So I'm not surprised that in our modern history, the alliance between the army and the brothers has been done over and over and over.
It's very interesting that you say that. You know what, it reminds me of Turkey a bit, because I spent many years, I lived in Istanbul for 12 years, and most of my books have to do with Istanbul and Asia Minor. And Turks very often have been presented with this dilemma, either democratically elected, perhaps Islamist-leaning government, or a quasi-democracy which is under military tutelage. Is this the same dire dilemma that Egyptians face? Because, I mean, in your novel, in The Republic of False Truth, you portray a lot of characters. I mean, the middle-class Coptic Lady Magda, or the general Alwani. I mean, everybody seems to be presenting this dilemma. It's either the military, it's either the dictatorship, the regime as it is, or it will be an Islamist government. But is this dichotomy false? Because, as you say, and as we understand from the news and what we read coming out from Egypt these days, the military hasn't really promoted secularism, it hasn't really promoted human rights, it hasn't really promoted the liberation of women or the protection of non-Muslims in Egypt. Is there any other voice, a third voice, perhaps among young people, that can take the situation forward beyond the military and beyond the Islamist movements? A third way, perhaps?
Absolutely. The revolution was the third voice and the third choice. And what happened, because people usually miss the details, the Muslim Brothers announced 2 days before the revolution that they will not participate because they don't feel that a revolution is a good thing to do. And they waited until the revolution. After 3 days, it was very evident that the revolution will overcome. And then they joined negotiations with Omar Suleiman, number 2 in the regime, the Mubarak regime. And that was the beginning of the alliance. So the second day of the revolution, we had a very big announcement in the Tahrir Square, a civil state, not religious and not military. That's why the current regime is considering the revolutionaries the real enemy. You know, the conflict between the Islamists and the military is a conflict of power. Mm-hmm. But the conflict between the revolution and the army is the conflict of principles. And the army understands, the military, the dictator understands that the real danger is the revolutionary youth, and it's not the Muslim Brothers.
In the Republic of False Truths, you portray many of the older characters, like the former communist mechanic Isan Shalan, or the military people deployed, or just simply people on the street of an older generation. They say, nothing is going to be fixed in this country. The Egyptians are passive. They won't claim their rights. They're submissive to authority. And then you portray with a lot of empathy the young people who are ready to even die for what they believe in. Do you think that the revolution has changed society a bit, that it has made people young and maybe not so young even more assertive, more ready to protest, to take to the streets, even though we see now that Egypt is again under a dystopia?
Yes, of course. We don't have to forget that 60% of Egyptians are under the age of 35. Accordingly, you're talking about young generation which will take over in few years. Even if they, and this is a real problem for the dictator, you see, because he cannot send millions of young people to prison. Accordingly, yes, Egypt has changed. And I have a book called The Dictatorship Syndrome, mm-hmm. in which I try to analyze what you just said. The old people who were born, raised, and they got married, they had kids, and they retired under a dictatorship, they find difficulties to struggle for freedom. You see? Why? Because if somebody who is 65 years old and you tell him, I will take to the street, I will protest because the elections were rigged, he will tell you, listen, I mean, the elections have been rigged since I was a kid. Mm-hmm. So what? You see, what happened is that a new conscience, and this new conscience belongs to the new generation, basically. Why? Because we don't know exactly why, but probably this new generation is much more connected to the world, to the different countries, to the democratic countries. So they have developed a pattern of life. They want to change their country. Their parents didn't want to change their country. They wanted to change their own life. So they were looking for contracts, generous contracts in the Gulf to make fortune, and they used to work for 20 years in the Gulf and then get back to the country with some money or a lot of money. But the difference of conscience between the new generation and the old people is huge.
Mm-hmm. What do you think they're looking up to? What do you think their models are? I'm not talking about people who have lived abroad and are familiar with different societies, but your younger friends and people you know that live permanently in Egypt. When they think of change, what models do you think they're looking up to? Because in your novel, I also noticed that a lot of them, first and foremost, interpret still everything through religion. Does this make them sort of really conservative, or do you think that religion works a bit still to make even the young people a bit more cautious, a bit more conformist in a way? Does it sort of impede their liberation from political norms as they have been?
Well, my opinion is that religion will never be useful to make a real progress. I believe that religion should be a personal matter. Mm-hmm. You are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, no matter what, this is something, this is your own business. I have no business with that. And the state should not have a religion. Because when the state has a religion, this is going to be harmful to everybody. It sounds like I'm talking about the Western experience, but this is not true. That was the conscience in Egypt before the coup of 1952. Despite the fact that there was the British occupation and there was a kind of corrupt king, authoritarian king, but there was a real struggle for democracy, and we had the first constitution in the region, 1923, and the first elected government, 1924, and the secular state was the goal of everybody. What happened is that Egypt fell after that in the hands of the military rule. And of course, they don't appreciate democracy at all. And they presented a kind of military, revolutionary, leftist dictatorship, which was by that time, I'm not saying acceptable, but it was not uncommon. It was in the Latin America.
It was the fashion.
It was in Cuba, Latin America. And then after that, we fell in another terrible thing. We fell in the Wahhabism. So you have a secular revolutionary, and all revolutionaries are secular. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about Egypt. Mm-hmm. And you have an Islamist. And they were both against Mubarak regime. And probably they are both against Sisi regime. But they are not the same. Mm-hmm. The goals are not the same. The secular revolutionary wants to make a modern democratic country, and the Islamist wants to make the Khilafah, wants to make the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. And we have discovered this during the struggle, is that they are with you, but temporarily. And after that, they have their own agenda.
Yes, they hijacked, they fed on the revolution to gain popularity, and then they hijacked it, isn't that true? And but still the people voted for them. I'm just wondering why, to this day, Islamist movements are so popular when you have at least a semblance of free elections. They seem to win the hearts and minds of many people. Is this?
We never had any free elections in Egypt. The Muslim Brothers, and this has been documented over and over and over. They used to buy the votes of the poor people, and they used to give them food. And we have videos, we have many things. But we used to report this to the army, and the army was the ally of the brothers. So they did nothing. So I don't believe in any results of any elections done under the army, you know. And I saw with my eyes, and we have videos that the brothers were buying the votes of the poor people. And I don't call this democracy at all, you see. For example, in the syndicate of the medical syndicate of physicians in Alexandria, they lost because you cannot buy food or bribe the physicians, you know. So the problem is that at some point the Western governments had their plans to keep the Islamists in power in the Arab world. And of course, for the interest of the Western governments, it was okay, because if the Islamists will be in power, it means that there will be no more terrorist attacks in the West. And second, they could oblige Hamas to be soft with Israel. That was the two goals of the Western support of the Islamists. Accordingly, they just didn't mention anything, the Western governments, about the elections where poor people are selling their votes because they want to eat. So I don't recognize any results of those votes.
I would ask you this. Do you think that because you mentioned about Western support for Islamists, do you think that Western governments, the Western press, Western societies, that they failed really to support?
I don't hear, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Could you repeat? I don't hear you.
Yes. Do you think Western governments, Western societies and Western NGOs even, that they failed to come to the aid, to support those forces in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world that wanted change, but in a secular way, that they failed to assist them?
Well, the West is not the Western governments. The Western governments, especially the right-wing governments, they have their own agenda, and they want to keep the business and successful, and they are defending, many times they are defending the interests of the multinational corporations. The West is you, the West is the intellectuals, the general opinion, the ordinary people, and those people, the Westerns, the normal ordinary people, as soon as they understand what is happening, of course they will support the revolution. And they will never support Islamic fascism, of course. But the Western governments, they are talking about principles, but they are defending interests. And they have been doing this for decades, you know, almost with no exception. Almost, with no exception. So you're talking about democracy, but you are supporting Sisi, because Sisi, for example, Sisi is the customer #1 in the arm industry in Germany. You see, the Sisi, for example, bought from France, you know, the Rafale and many things. So the Western governments or the Western politicians, they talk very well about democracy. Nobody else could talk like they talk about democracy. But when it comes to the interests of the multinational corporations, of course, they will deal with the most terrible dictator you could imagine. And that has been the case, you know, for 1 century, you know. It's not something new.
Okay, governments obviously are business as usual, and they're after sort of their business and military interests. But what about Western societies? Do you think that people understand what's going on in the Middle East, what the players are, what they advocate? Or do you think that they don't really get it? Because we hear more and more nowadays the thesis that societies in the Middle East are not ready for democracy, and when they do get free elections, they go and elect, you know, the Islamic movements or people who want to do away with democracy. How can we explain such behaviors in context? Because it would be too, I think, maybe patronizing or too, how should I say, too much of a disappointment to say that an entire people doesn't really understand how democracy works.
Well, it depends on if the people say this with good intention or with bad intention. With bad intention, there is what we call the moral cover of the colonialism and the moral cover of the dictatorship. A dictator will never tell you, I will rule, I will send everybody to prison and I will execute my opponents because I need to be rich. I need the commission, you know, they will never tell you this. He needs a moral cover. And the moral cover is just what you said, that people are not prepared for democracy, that I'm waiting until the people will be prepared for democracy. This is a bad intention, people. The good intention people, if they say that, it's a problem of information. Because, I mean, you could convince them just by, if they read half an hour online, they will understand that this is not the case. Because Egypt had, as I told you, the first constitution, the Arab world, was Egyptian, 1923. 1924, the prime minister of Egypt organized elections, and he lost his own seat in the parliament. You know, his name was Yahya Ibrahim. And Al-Wafd had an overwhelming majority. And for example, just an example quickly, the expenses of the royal palace were between 1924 and 1954, when Nasser just canceled the whole democratic system. During these 30 years, the expenses of the king and of the royal family were revised by the parliament. And you have many examples. For example, King Fuad wanted, during the 20s, wanted to make a trip in summer to Italy and Greece. And then the parliament said, if this is an official trip, you should take the Minister of Foreign Affairs with you. If you don't take the Minister of Foreign Affairs, we will consider it a personal trip and you will pay for it. We're not going to pay, right? So this happened in Egypt. So it's a problem. If you say that by good intention, the problem is very easy. Why? Because the solution is to read. Just 30 minutes. I will tell you what to read, and then you will be convinced that we have been democratic and we have had this conscience for democracy and everything. The problem is with bad intention. When you say this with bad intention, you'll never be convinced, because you're defending your dictatorship. You're defending your interest.
The young people in Egypt, you said, in comparison with older generations, are more open to the world, aren't they? How did this come about? Is it the internet? Is it because obviously it's not the official press, it's not the regime's television that connects them to the world. Do they read more? Do they have friendships abroad, developed maybe by social media? What has, you think, made them more world-minded and more assertive about their rights?
You know, in life, there are things which are organic and things that are inorganic. And I will explain. Things are inorganic is that you could understand all the components. Things which are organic, they belong to life. And the most important component in life is not definable. So, for example, the revolution is an organic phenomenon. The novel, writing a novel is organic. Falling in love is organic. You fall in love with somebody and you cannot explain the most important reason why you have fallen in love with this person and not the other persons, because it's organic. Why you write this novel and not the other novels, you cannot really find the main reason. The revolution is no exception. Why the revolution happened now and not before, and why the same problems are repeated and there is no revolution, because the spark is organic. Of course, all what you said, they are true, is that this generation is more related through internet to the West. They are more westernized. All those are reasons, but the main reason is not definable. It's like you fall in love because this person is beautiful, because you feel comfortable with him or with her. But all those are reasons, but the main reason is not definable.
Are you an optimist about the future in Egypt? I mean, reading The Republic of False Truths. I mean, this is the Greek cover, by the way. I sort of inhaled this sort of climate of despair, where you have different generations of Egyptians having fought and having suffered for freedom, and then, of course, an unholy alliance just cancels the last attempt. Do you think that in the sort of, let's say, not in the short term perhaps, but in the midterm, do you think that the youth, the people that, what you called and what we both understand as the secular revolutionaries, do you think they will make a change?
Yeah, absolutely. I must here explain that my characters in my novels are totally independent, in the sense that they are talking for themselves and not for me. And I don't talk for them. Accordingly, you will find some characters who are saying to me terrible opinions, but this is their opinions, you know. Accordingly, yes, it's true in the novel you have people who are desperate, frustrated, but I'm not desperate as a person, and I'm not frustrated, because, as you know, in fiction, I create the character, and then at some point I lose control on the character. The character becomes independent. He or she will decide for themselves, and they will talk for themselves. My personal opinion is not what the characters are saying. And I don't put my personal opinion in the novel, because it's a wrong place. Writing a novel is creating a life. Is not. I put my personal opinion in my articles, not in the fiction. My personal opinion is that I am absolutely optimistic. Why? Because simply I read the history of the revolutions. You know, 10 years after the French revolutions, it was totally chaotic. Everybody was killing everybody. And then after that, the old regime got back to power, you see. But what is important in the revolution basically is a human change. It's not a political change. People at some point become different. They see everything differently. Accordingly, this new conscious is irreversible. And of course, you have the counter-revolution, which is typical. The counter-revolution will try to fight back, to try to crack down on the revolution. And the counter-revolution has very strong tools. the counter-revolution has the army, has the media, has the police. And the revolution has what? The revolutionary people, they have their conscience, their intelligence, their dream, their will, and their courage. And all those tools are moral. So it takes time, but no one single counter-revolution has overcome for good. It's always in the history a temporary winning of the game, of the fight between the revolution and counter-revolution. The counter-revolution will temporarily win, but the revolution will overcome. This is 100%.
I always saw your books as a sort of an X-ray of Egyptian society, with all these, with its different sort of classes, its different categories of thought, and all this sort of at times schizophrenic coexistence of people that ideologically and socially may have nothing to do with each other, but they have to coexist in the same city, at sometimes in the same building. I would ask you how, because you write a lot about sexuality, about
could you please?
Yes.
There is a very strong echo. So, could you please? I don't know where this echo comes from, but could you please repeat the last sentence?
Yes, you write a lot about sexuality, about relations between men and women,
coexistence.
And
yes.
Mm-hmm. How has flirting and relationships between men and women, and possibly between homosexual couples, how has this changed in the course of your life? What do you see different now? I mean, the revolution in everyday life, the revolution in relationships, in flirting, in friendships perhaps in Egypt. How different are things now for the young people?
Everything has been different now. It's different, you know. The way people see religions, for example, young people, the way they understand patriotism. You know, the dictatorship is always promoting a wrong meaning of patriotism, is that you support the dictator, because if you support the dictator, you support your country. And the revolution changed this totally. And the private life for the revolutionaries has been something we should respect. So or the sexual orientation of anybody is his or her own business. So many things had changed. And I would say that the revolution liberated the Egyptian mind, at least the revolutionaries, from the Wahhabism, from 40 years of Wahhabism, you see.
Which was imported, right? It was imported by the workers who went to the Gulf. It's not an Egyptian phenomenon.
Very important.
Yeah.
Very important. So you find, for example, the Wahhabi Sheikh now, they have lost most of their popularity. Why? Because the revolutionary youth saw them while they were tools of the dictator, and they were not, that was not visible before the revolution. So they are considered like businessmen more than people of faith.
Yes, you portray one in this book, Wahhabi Sheikh, and I think it's one of the most interesting of your characters. Yeah, because exactly you portray how religion can be used as a political tool to actually cover corruption.
Absolutely. And you could see now, of course, that's why, that was, I will not give example by the Western governments. I will give example by Egypt during, as I told you, that between 1923 and 1954, when they made the Constitution 1923. We have the discussions, and there was one code in the Constitution: the freedom of faith is allowed to any citizen, every citizen. And people in the committee objected. That's happened 1922. Objected. Why? They said, when you say the freedom of faith, you are referring to a religion. And we have citizens who might be atheists, non-believers. And they changed the code to the freedom of belief, not of faith. And this happened in Egypt 100 years ago. You see? So, of course, our conscience has been deformed by the Wahhabism. And Egypt is getting rid of this disease. I consider the Wahhabism is a disease.
Yes, and it's a disease that came from abroad, moreover. It was imported into the country from the workers that went to the Gulf, right? And actually took Egyptian society hostage. Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you, Mr. Al-Aswani. I have to say that I personally really enjoyed the Republic of False Truths. I'm sure that Greek readers will find it very revealing, because although the two countries are geographically very close and we share so much common history, I think that after Nasser and after the military rule in Egypt, the ways sort of departed, and unfortunately the average citizen in Greece doesn't know much about Egypt. And I think that with your books you contribute a lot to this knowledge. And I'm personally, as a reader of your books, I'm very eagerly waiting for your novel on Alexandria, and I'm sure the Greek public will embrace it very warmly.
Thank you very much. It has been a very interesting and enjoyable to me discussion, and I thank you very much. And I thank everybody who made this meeting possible, and I thank also the people who have been following or listening to us. Thank you very much.
It was my great pleasure, and I hope to meet you in person when you come to Greece to present your next book.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.